I'm Mr. MegaManFan, and we start out Genesis Does this week with a shout out to hiddenpalace.org. If you're looking for Sega Genesis prototypes or prototypes of all kinds, obscure, rare, hard to find vintage video game code that could have been lost to time, they have been dumping it and preserving it since 2005. And this was a game they had been looking for ever since the site's inception. For over 15 years, hiddenpalace.org was looking for a Sonic 1 prototype. And as they say themselves in the write-up, which is called Dreams Come True, there were some who believed this was never going to happen. They would go down the rabbit hole, as the author describes it. They would talk to a video game magazine employee who would say something like, "Oh yeah, I had that prototype, but I threw all that stuff away." It happened over and over again. And they were getting more and more worried with each year that passed by that if there was a Sonic 1 prototype out there somewhere, the EEPROM would be dead, the cartridge wouldn't work, the code would be lost forever. And then, one day, like a miracle, it actually happened. The prototype was released on December 31st, 2020, or January 1st, 2021, depending on what part of the world you lived in and what time zone you were in at the time. But it was released at the end of 2020 and start of 2021. So, kind of a good way to celebrate what had been a very awful year. The long-awaited Sonic 1 prototype had finally emerged from the wild. Here are some of the differences that you will notice not only when you check out the download for yourself, which is free and anybody can go to hiddenpalace.org and try it, but when you watch this gameplay footage, you will notice some of these things too. Like, for example, you get a very bog standard Sega title screen when you open the game. It doesn't go, Sega! There's nothing special there. It's just the standard boilerplate trademark and logo. The title screen also tells you to press the start button, which the actual Sonic the Hedgehog cartridge does not. The code exists for both, but in the prototype it works, and in the actual released version there's a glitch, and that's why it doesn't show up. It's there, but you can't see it. The palette is a little different. Sonic looks a little brighter compared to his normal version in the released game. The names of some of the levels are different, like Spring Yard Zone and Scrap Brain Zone are referred to as Sparkling Zone and Clockwork Zone, and some of the levels are incomplete or don't work. There's a hidden Act 4 for Green Hill Zone, which was used for testing and debugging purposes, and there are differences in the level layout, including a rolling ball that appears to be a carbon copy of the wrecking ball that Dr. Robotnik/Eggman swings at you in Act 3 of Green Hill Zone. Except, you can't really do much with it. It just chases you if you push it, and if it falls on you, it squishes you, but you can't squish other enemies with it. You can't run on top of it like you're balancing on top of a giant ball like a circus act. It's just there to annoy you or roll over you. It has no real purpose other than that. It's vaguely interactive, but not too terribly interactive. But it's different because that doesn't exist in the final build, along with a lot of other things. The layout for the Marble Zone has these UFOs in the background. You'll see that in a few minutes here. And those don't exist in the final build either, which I'm glad of because they're awfully garish and busy. I suppose they were meant to remind us that there are marbles everywhere, even in the sky, because they look like rotating UFO marbles, but at the same time, I think it was overkill. I think the fact that the actual underground area of Marble Hill Zone looks like it was made from marble stone is probably enough of a tie-in without having the garish UFOs above him when he's in the overworld. And as far as gameplay differences, you will notice a few things as well. Up in the upper left-hand corner where your stats are, it says ring instead of rings. When you start a level, it says act with a period instead of act with no period. It's not an abbreviation, so I don't know why they did that. There's no timeout if you get to 9 minutes and 59 seconds. It just loops back to 9 minutes. But I didn't purposefully run up any level to 10 minutes because that would just pad out the length of this video unnecessarily. You can take my word for it, or you can try it for yourself. Also, the final boss in Act 3 is the only appearance of Dr. Robotnik in the game. Eggman has not been programmed as a boss into any of the other sections in the game. That is how early this build is. There are also no checkpoints, so you can't save your progress. If you die anywhere on a level, you have to do the whole level over again. And there's no way to enter the special stages. They're programmed into the game, but you can't generate the gold ring that Sonic needs to leap through at the end of his stage. It just doesn't appear, it doesn't exist, it doesn't happen. And when you watch the special stage in the demo, you can tell even that is programmed incompletely because there's a goal right at the beginning, but when Sonic touches it, he doesn't exit out of the special stage. So clearly, this was a rough build. They were still working some things out at the time. Not all the levels have been programmed, not all the enemies have been programmed, not all the boss encounters have been programmed. There was no way to get special stages, no way to save your progress with checkpoints. There's a lot of things missing from this game, but it's also very fascinating for the differences that exist in the game that make it unlike any other version of Sonic the Hedgehog that you've ever played. There are a lot of people who deserve credit for this prototype even existing at all, so I will read directly from the acknowledgments on hiddenpalace.org. As detailed in the initial announcement, the search for this storied prototype was a massive effort with many people involved. We'd like to thank X-Keeper, Rusty, the whole TCRF crew, that would be short for the cutting room floor by the way, for being bros keeping things under control. Nick from Retro Gamer, Franz, EHW, and Saz Paimon, this is our wedding gift to you, for being part of the Hidden Palace crew. All of our supporters who have kept the site alive for many, many years, Sega and Sonic Team for creating such an awesome game and series, and Buckaroo for being extremely generous in letting us and the rest of the world have the opportunity to play this very important artifact in gaming history. Now, bottom line here is you're still going to want to play regular Sonic the Hedgehog. You can do this as an experiment to test all the different things. There's even a level select that you can use to skip around in it so you can try things that you want to. You press A and start on the final screen, and that will let you pick the levels that do exist to try them out. But you can't finish the game. Not every level is playable. Not all the enemies are there. So you want to do this just to look at a slice in time to when Sonic the Hedgehog was not even a known quantity in Japan or the United States. He'd made one cameo appearance in a video game as an air freshener hanging from the rearview mirror of a car that was being driven in a game, and that was as recognized as Sonic was at the time, which was to say, not recognized at all. So this is a moment in time before Sonic was a franchise, before this game made him a household name all around the world, before it spawned countless sequels and a cartoon and another cartoon and some really bad games in the 2000s and some pretty good ones in the 2010s and 20s. And here we are now on the verge of another Sonic the Hedgehog movie coming out, and the last one was actually pretty good, so I will definitely be going to see the second one, and I will probably be playing more of this prototype between now and then, because it's just fun to poke around and look at something that was thought to be lost, found to exist, and see all the ways that Sonic the Hedgehog changed from when they were first building it to when it was finally created. There's a lot of mysteries to uncover in the Sonic the Hedgehog universe. You have to go to hiddenpalace.org to really find out more about all of them, because there are still prototypes to this day that they're looking for, and there are still things in the prototypes that haven't been fully debugged or documented yet, so the search never ends, the quest is ongoing, and that's what keeps the site alive and keeps the supporters so firmly in their corner. I'm Mr. MegaManFan. Welcome back to Genesis Does, and this week we're doing something a little bit different. We're taking a look at prototypes that are from hiddenpalace.org. If you don't know the story of Hidden Palace, it's a scrapped level from Sonic the Hedgehog 2 that shows up in a prototype version of the game and has actually been restored in some versions of the game that have come out in more recent years, but was never actually intended to be played by the public until that time. So what better name to give a website full of prototypes than to call it Hidden Palace? Seems pretty appropriate, don't you think? And we're starting this episode with Lobo, the intergalactic bounty hunter himself. You may know him well from DC Comics, but now you'll know him from this video game. Here are some notes from Hidden Palace about it. For our third release, Sega Saturno is proud to present a never-released game of the main man. The famous interstellar biker and bounty hunter, Lobo joins the fun in this one-on-one brawler, featuring rendered graphics and button mashing by Ocean Software's American division. Intended for release in 1996 on the Super Nintendo and Sega Genesis, but canceled for both in a last-minute decision, now it's up to everyone to take part in this fighting frenzy set in the Lobo universe with a virtually completed build, which is probably what would have made it to stores had the game been released. The game is very similar to Killer Instinct, not only in the graphical department, but also on the side of combat basis and rules. Players have 3 life bars to beat their opponents instead of winning separated rounds. As a continuous bout, the match ends only when any of the characters deplete all of the opponent's 3 life bars. Several characters and game modes are present. Lobo has a specific solo venture in which he'll have to cross the universe looking for convicts of the likes of Kringle, Lou, Nitro, Shada, and Dox, which rate different cash rewards. All of these rival characters are also playable in the Versus Tournament and Practice modes, along with the main man himself. And, as you can see from my gameplay footage, this is pretty much as described. It's very Killer Instinct-esque. The combat is, as it was noted, 3 life bars that you have to deplete completely, each one resulting in your opponent being knocked down. And that's pretty much it. So I'm going to move on to a different prototype here and give you something else to look at. Let's go with Akira. This one is a very recent release for Hidden Palace, having only come out on December 25th, 2019, and there are a lot of notes about this one, and they may be longer than the gameplay itself because there's not a lot to see here, so I'll keep it to the highlights. Approximately 65% of the ROM content can be accessed within the game. The other 35% is non-null data. Developed by Black Pearl Software in 1993, intended for release in 1995. A lot of the music cues are present in the sound test but unused by the game itself. None of the levels can be completed. You can go back to the level selected anytime by pressing start. The first level lacks enemies. Oh, that's for damn sure. You'll see that in a second. The game is prone to crashing on the starting area of level 2. The cutscene that plays before 1K and 1T is the same. There is no cutscene before 4. The game freezes on loading the 5th stage. So what we have here is a video game based on the cult classic anime Akira, but in a very incomplete form. As you can see here, I'm riding a motorcycle around the streets of Neo Tokyo. There's some nice parallax scrolling here, and it's got kind of a road rash thing going on where I would be able to bash enemies ahead of me, behind me, and to the side of me, but unfortunately they didn't have any enemies programmed into it yet, and there's nothing to really listen to. And eventually, I just tried letting the bike drift since I couldn't seem to speed up or slow down, and the bike doesn't even crash. It just hugs the edges. It swipes from one side to the other, but you never actually wipe out. So there is literally nothing to do here. And to be honest, I thought If this is this incomplete and it has this many crashes in it, I don't think I'm going to try any of the other levels. I think I'm just going to go on to another prototype, but I'm still impressed that this is in any kind of playable state and that it exists. The only other Akira prototypes I know of were for the Game Boy, and they were discovered a couple of years ago by a very well-known video game collector and preservationist who had eventually put them up for sale, and I hope they've been dumped since then, but I haven't kept track. So anyway, that's Akira. Let's move on to another prototype. This one's rather interesting. It is a prototype of a console-only sequel to Dragon's Lair called Dragon's Lair The Adventure Continues, made, as you can see, by Taito. So, what we have here is Dirk the Daring in a whole new adventure that's not animated by Don Bluth. I don't even know if he would have had any input into this version of the game other than licensing the character. There's not a whole lot of information about it on Hidden Palace. It says it was dumped by Mr. Mark 0673 from an EEPROM cartridge, and it's been owned by him since 2011, and that's really just about all that it says. So there are these snake-looking monsters that I can bash. I've got a timer telling me how long I have to complete the level. I've got items I can smash open and collect. The barrels and boxes don't seem to be destructible, and there are platforms that rise and lower, so we've got a traversable area with different kinds of ways to get up and down it, and you can fall off the bottom and die. So there is at least some amount of work that's already been put into this prototype to make it quasi-playable. It obviously needs more to be a fully finished game, but they've got definite elements of an interesting side-scrolling platforming Dirk the Daring type game here that I think, had it made it to a fully finished state, could have actually been something. It has all the elements. It's got good foreground and background details. Dirk looks acceptable compared to his cartoon counterpart. I think this shouldn't have been canceled. I wish I knew more about it other than the fact that this prototype exists and is available to play on Hidden Palace, but add in some music, add in some levels, add in some gameplay tips and a manual and a box. I think this really could have been a good one. Now, this next one actually did get released in a finished state, so what we have here is a prototype of Growl from August 26, 1991, with the quote, "appears to have been built a few months before the Japanese release." So let me tell you a little more about the Japanese release. Growl, known in Japan as Runark, is a belt-scrolling beat-em-up originally in arcades in 1990. Set in the early 20th century, the player controls a forest ranger who must protect the local wildlife from a group of evil poachers who are driving the animals to extinction. A home version was released for Mega Drive on November 1991. It was also included in the compilation Taito Legends 2 for the PlayStation 2, Xbox, and Microsoft Windows. Now, I have to admit, even though it's cartoony 16-bit violence, I was a little bit surprised at just how much there is in this belt-scrolling action game as it's been described on Wikipedia here. You've got guns, knives, rocket launchers, barrels that explode, dynamite. I mean, there's a whole lot of shit going on in this game. I'm kind of surprised I had never heard of it before playing this prototype. I kind of want to see how the finished game compares to it now, so I'm going to have to do some more research, but I'm amused that it's got a Double Dragon aesthetic to it where you can hit people, knock the weapons out of their hands, and then use their weapons against them. I did get some satisfaction out of taking out these poachers with a whip, Indiana Jones style. I think this is definitely the most fun of all of the prototypes I've played, and shows why this one actually made it to a finished state and was released as a game. The arcade source material that they based it on was obviously quite good. And at any point now, I expect Ryan Taylor will leave a comment saying, "Yeah, I played this one as a kid. It's great." You were lucky, my friend. You had a Genesis as a kid. I didn't have one until college, and by then, all I really knew was Sonic the Hedgehog and NHL 94. And as a college student, I didn't really have a whole bunch of money to go and check out a whole bunch of games, nor did I even have a store anywhere nearby that rented Genesis games. So as a college student, I just had what I had, and a lot of this stuff I didn't discover until years and years later when I became a collector. But anyway, Growl is a fun prototype, and I suspect an even better fully finished game, so let's just leave it there. Now, this next one did come out in Brazil in 1996 in a finished state, and was briefly available for people who had the Sega channel and the Sega cable modem to play as a download to their cartridge, which meant it was only there for as long as you kept it there until you overrode it by something else. So this one basically didn't exist in a cartridge form except in Brazil, and a prototype that was owned by Kevtris. Yes, that same legendary Kevtris who has created FPGA and cores for some of your favorite retro gaming consoles. But let's not go into Kevtris history too much. Let's talk about what Nightmare Circus is. The story begins with a circus in the desert of Arizona. Opening night, the circus burned completely to the ground by a shady and villainous operator named the Jester, who intended to cash in on an insurance policy. Jester was convicted for the deaths of the victims, but before he was executed, Jester warned that the souls of his victims would be forever tormented. Many years later, a Native American named Raven, who lost relatives in the fire, goes to investigate the location where the circus was held and where supernatural events have been reported. Night comes, and suddenly there appears via the psi energy of the Jester a ghostly apparition of the destroyed circus. Now, that might be more interesting in the actual game, but in this prototype, you really can't do anything, so fuck it, we're moving on to Pugsley. What on earth is Pugsley? Well, he appears to be a walking nose with a nose who really likes apples. What? What in the hell even? And you can jump on these apples. You can apparently use them as platforms themselves. Let's see what the notes here read at Hidden Palace regarding Pugsley. Version 0.1 prototype. The ROM has been modified from the original due to a bug that caused it to not work. The ROM was released by means of a YouTube video. The ROM appears as a sequence of images with black and white squares that represent a bit. The ROM in this article was put together by Novadicious, Mr. Potato Badger, V0M, and the Stone Banana as a binary file so it can be downloaded. But there's really nothing to do in it, so we're moving on. And guess what we're moving on to? This will look very familiar. It's called Same, but guess what? I just recently played this game. That's right, if it looks familiar, this is Fire Shark. Other than the change of name, it appears to be almost the same game. So I'm just going to move on to a different prototype here. And let's take a look at the Flintstones. Meet the Flintstones. They're the modern Stone Age family. Here is a character that looks like John Goodman. And he fell right to his death. He's dead. And there's really not much to do here. I think all the enemies disappeared. Flintstones. Here's Fred Flintstone. He can run around and jump up. He can grab on ledges. And that's really all to do. Seriously, there's no more than that here. You can manipulate this boulder into this box to make a platform you can reach up. And you can run up here to the top of this series of prehistoric levels. And eventually you'll reach a dead end where it looks like you can jump all the way to a platform to the right, but you can never quite reach it no matter how much of running start you get. And there's no way to pick up speed. I held down the A, B, C, X, Y, and Z, all trying to get a running start to jump a little further and maybe reach that platform on the other side. But I couldn't do it no matter what I tried. And if I didn't hit the jump early enough, I just fell off and fell back down. So there's not too much to this one, other than a creepily John Goodman looking sprite that runs around on the screen. So that's the Flintstones. I'm Mr. MegaManFan, and this is Genesis Does, where today we're looking at Frog Dude. Dude, what is Frog Dude? Well, there's some things we know and some things we don't know. Let's start with the things we do know. This game was in development in the early 1990s. The apparent developer was Twilight, a UK video game group that was in business from 1989 to 1995. They were skilled in doing video game conversions to different platforms, including ZX Spectrum, Amstrad CPC, Commodore 64, Atari ST, and so on. The list of games they developed is quite diverse, from Quick Draw McGraw to Darkman to WWF WrestleMania to Bonanza Brothers. They were quite experienced. This build of Frog Dude comes from Andrew Swan, who was one of the programmers who worked at Twilight at the time. It seems that he kept this long after his time at Twilight and eventually just decided to release it on the internet for posterity, where it ended up at hiddenpalace.org, and I would venture to say that their notes about the game come directly from him, because they say development of the game was shelved in favor of Alfred Chicken. Well, Alfred Chicken is another one of Twilight's properties, and it came out in 1993, so if you want to extrapolate from that limited amount of information, it seems that Frog Dude and Alfred Chicken were in development simultaneously, and after they demoed Frog Dude at some consumer shows and trade events, they decided, well, we've got something here, but we've got something better with Alfred Chicken, because we're getting a better response to that. So we're going to shelve Frog Dude and keep working on Alfred Chicken. Which is a shame, really, because if you look at Frog Dude, I feel like there was some potential here. We don't really know what the plot is. You're just a dude who can transform into a frog and back into a dude again. Why? I don't know. Your castle is hit by lightning, and apparently it turns into an evil monster that could eat you. Why? We don't know. But there's a germ of a good idea here. It has the feel of Wonder Boy in Dragon's Trap. It's got that adventurous spirit to it where you can transform into different monsters and they have different abilities. When you're the frog, you can leap higher than when you're the dude. You can also flick out your tongue to pick up items. When you're the dude, you just have a flail that you swing around. The flail can hit the items too, but it's more fun to grab stuff with the tongue. It's a very Yoshi thing to do. In fact, when you flick out your tongue to grab these apples or whatever fruits they are that are hanging in the air, he actually chews and swallows them, so maybe they were worried it was a little too like Yoshi and that Nintendo would come after them at some point. Now, the graphics are simple but effective. Obviously, if this had progressed, they would have added some more layers of scrolling and some more depth to the background instead of just a plain blue sky with white clouds in it. And the barrels have a stopgap feel, like we need to put obstacles in the way for the dude or the frog to either leap up and grab higher items or leap over to get to the next section. I don't know if barrels would have really fit the theme. And these stacks of platforms having different colors suggests they just pick the colors at random to differentiate one area from the next. It doesn't really feel like a design choice to have yellow then pink for no reason. Or maybe it's orange. I don't know. Everybody's color perception is different. The human eye works different for different people. But to me, it's a yellowish and a pinkish color for these ground blocks that are stacked on top of each other. It all has a little bit of randomness to it, but at the same time, you can tell the thought that went into it because There are areas where you jump onto hooks and they kind of rebound you up to higher levels. And when you're the frog, you can kind of bounce with your jump and you can bounce from one hook to the next to get to higher areas really fast. And there's even an apple hidden below this bridge, which to me suggests they would have programmed a way to jump down to lower areas, but it hasn't been programmed in yet. Or there would have been a hidden entrance to reach it, but they didn't code that in yet. There would have been items to collect other than just these apples, is my assumption. And there's no sound for this game because apparently this was too early for the demo to even include a soundtrack or any kind of sound effects. They just wanted to show a proof of concept that the game actually worked. And it scrolls very smoothly and the animation is fluid. Other than that, there's nothing else to add. It's just a demo that exists that shows some promise and is intriguing to mess around with, but there's no threat here. You can't jump into any bottomless pits. There are no enemies to hit you and kill you. There's nothing to fight. There's no boss to beat. Once you get to a certain point in Frog Dude, you just have to throw in the towel and say, it's a proof of concept. They did something interesting here. It's a shame they didn't take it any further because it feels like they had an idea and I would have liked to have seen where they went with it. We don't do prototypes all the time on Genesis Does, but this is definitely something that Nintendo don't.